The Last Guest at Willowbrook Inn, a Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The Closing of the Season. The last week of September brought with it the particular chill that visitors to Cravenwell always seem to find romantic, and the inhabitants always found a nuisance. Mist rolled in from the marshes each evening, settling over the thatched roofs and the narrow lane that ran past the church, and by the time it reached Willowbrook Inn, it had thickened into something that pressed against the window panes like a hand. Agnes Crewe had been telling her husband for a fortnight that this would be their final week of trade before they shut up the inn for winter, as they did every year, and Walter Crewe had been nodding without listening, his mind on the figures in the ledger that refused, no matter how he arranged them, to add up to anything but trouble. It was this final week that brought the stranger. He arrived on the Tuesday evening coach from Lewes, a tall man somewhere in his 50s, with iron-grey hair combed carefully over a thinning crown, and a manner of speaking that managed to be both pleasant and faintly unsettling, as though every sentence carried a second meaning just out of reach. He signed the guest book as Mr. Felix Harman, of London, and gave no further account of his business, though he asked Agnes Crewe, with a smile she would later describe to the vicar as not quite a smile at all, whether the village had changed much in the last 15 years. "I couldn't say, sir," Agnes told him, setting down his key. "We've only kept the inn these past 9. "No matter," said Mr. Harman. "I dare say it's the people who interest me more than the buildings." He took his supper alone in the small dining room, declining the company of the other 2 guests, a retired schoolmaster named Mr. Albert Quill, who was touring the Sussex churches, and a young woman called Miss Prudence Ashworth's niece, down from Brighton for her aunt's birthday. He spoke to no one beyond what courtesy required, ate sparingly, and retired early, asking Agnes to see that his window was left latched, as he suffered, he said, from a delicate chest and could not abide a draught. It was Daisy Fenn, the inn's young maid, who found him the next morning when she brought up his tea at 7:30 and could not rouse him with her knocking. She opened the door to find the room thick with a smell she could not name, sweetish, faintly metallic, and Mr. Felix Harman lying quite still upon the bed, his face the colour of old wax, the gas fire in the corner hissing its small blue flame into a room from which, Daisy would swear later through her tears, every breath of fresh air had been shut firmly out. Dr. Owen Pascoe was sent for at once, and arrived within the half-hour, his bag in hand and his expression already composed into the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. "Asphyxiation," he pronounced after a brief examination. "The gas geyser in the bathroom along the corridor. These old systems are never properly vented, and if the window was shut as well," he shook his head. "A tragedy, but not, I think, a mystery. These old inns are death traps for a man with a weak chest who doesn't know to leave a window cracked." Inspector Hargreave, summoned from the larger town of Marsh Otterton some 6 miles distant, arrived by midday and seemed disposed to agree. There was no sign of struggle, no mark upon the body beyond what gas poisoning might explain, and no obvious reason why anyone should wish harm to a stranger who had been in the village scarcely 12 hours. "An accident, Crewe," the inspector said to Walter, not unkindly, as the body was carried down the narrow staircase on a covered stretcher. "A bad one, and bad for your trade besides, I shouldn't wonder, but an accident all the same." It was an opinion that would have stood, quite possibly, had it not been for a small, elderly woman taking her tea in the front parlour of Willowbrook Inn that very afternoon, a guest of some 3 days' standing, there to visit her godson, the new schoolmaster at Cravenwell, who said nothing at all to the inspector, but who had noticed, while pretending great interest in her knitting, that the window of the dead man's room, visible from the garden path, had been shut tight the evening before, though Daisy Fenn had distinctly mentioned, in the kitchen that very morning, that Mr. Harman had asked most particularly that it be left ajar. Miss Jane Marple said nothing of this to anyone. She merely continued with her knitting and waited. Chapter 2. Tongues in the Tap Room. By 6 o'clock that evening, there was not a soul in Cravenwell who had not heard of the death at Willowbrook Inn, and there was not a soul who did not have an opinion about it, freely offered to whoever would listen in the low-beamed tap room that adjoined the inn's front parlour. "Gas," said old Mr. Birtwell, who had farmed the water meadows below the church for 40 years and considered himself an authority on most matters mechanical. "I told Crewe years back that Geyser wanted replacing. Told him plain, a man'll save a shilling and lose his custom. That's the way of it." "It wasn't the Geyser killed him," said his neighbour at the bar, a thin, sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Cordelia Whitfield, who rented the white cottage by the mill pond, and was, by her own frequent insistence, a woman of considerable worldly experience. "I had a look at that room myself, this afternoon, before the inspector's men sealed it. The window was shut tight as a drum. Now you tell me why a man who asks special for his window open should be found with it shut." This observation, offered with the particular relish of a woman who enjoyed being first with unpleasant news, did a great deal to unsettle what had, until that moment, been a comfortably tragic but uncomplicated story. "Perhaps the maid shut it," suggested the Reverend Aubrey Laycock, who had come in for his evening half-pint as he did most days, and who had a gentle, conciliatory manner that smoothed over a great many village disputes before they properly began. "Girls forget instructions. It's hardly sinister. Daisy Fenn doesn't forget anything," said Mrs. Whitfield darkly. "That girl notices everything that goes on in that inn. Ask her yourself." It was Miss Prudence Ashworth, however, a spinster of uncertain age who lived with her niece in the cottage behind the church, and was generally regarded as the most observant gossip in 3 parishes, a reputation she cultivated with some pride, who offered the theory that would dominate village conversation for the better part of a week. "That young man," she said, lowering her voice to the particular pitch she reserved for matters of real significance, "the one who was seen arguing with Mr. Harmon yesterday afternoon by the churchyard wall, Thomas Renshaw, loud enough that half the choir heard it, by all accounts." "Renshaw owes money all over the village," put in Mr. Birtwell. "Owes me for feed, owes the smithy, owes half the public house its slate. Wouldn't surprise me if he owed this Harmon fellow too, and didn't fancy paying." "And where is young Renshaw today?" Miss Ashworth asked, with the air of a woman producing a winning card. "Nowhere to be found, that's where. Gone since this morning, before the body was even cold." This last detail, true as far as it went, spread through Cravenwell with remarkable speed, and by the time Inspector Hargreave returned to the village the following morning, he found a population already convinced that the mystery, if mystery it was, had solved itself. Miss Marple, who had listened to the whole of this conversation from a corner seat near the fire, her knitting needles clicking steadily, said only, when the Reverend Lecoq politely asked her opinion, that village quarrels were very rarely about what they appeared to be about, and that she had always found Thomas Renshaw a remarkably honest young man for one so often in debt, which struck the vicar as a curious sort of compliment, and one he found himself thinking about for some time afterward. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Diagnosis. Dr. Owen Pascoe's surgery stood at the western edge of the village, a low stone building with a brass plate beside the door, so old that the lettering had worn nearly smooth. He had practised in Cravenwell for 11 years, since returning from the war with a limp he never discussed, and a manner that the village had come, over time, to find reassuring rather than cold. It was to this surgery that Inspector Hargreave came on the Wednesday morning, seeking the formal medical opinion that would, in the ordinary course of things, close the matter entirely. "Carbon monoxide poisoning," Pascoe said, consulting his notes with the brisk efficiency of a man who had performed 100 such examinations and saw no reason this one should detain him longer than necessary. "Consistent in every particular, with a faulty gas appliance in a sealed room. The geyser along that corridor is old. I've treated 2 cases of mild gas sickness from it myself. guests with headaches who didn't think to mention they'd had their window shut. This is simply the first time it's proved fatal. And the window? Hargreave asked. I'm told the dead man asked specifically that it be left open. Pascoe's expression did not change, though something in the set of his shoulders shifted, almost imperceptibly. Guests change their minds in the night, Inspector. A man complains of a chest, asks for air, then feels the cold come in, and shuts it himself an hour later, without thinking what he's doing. It's the commonest thing in the world. I shouldn't read too much into a closed window. No, said Hargreave, who was a practical man, with a backlog of paperwork waiting in Marsh Otterton, and very little appetite for complications, in a case that seemed, on every available evidence, perfectly straightforward. No, I don't suppose you should. He left the surgery satisfied, and within the hour had given instructions for the death to be recorded as misadventure, pending the inquest, which he expected would be a formality of perhaps 20 minutes. It was Miss Marple, walking past the surgery that same afternoon on her way to visit her godson at the schoolhouse, who happened to encounter Dr. Pascoe in his garden, tending with great concentration to a bed of late asters that had no real need of his attention. A sad business, Doctor, she said, pausing at the gate. Such a sudden end for a man none of us knew at all. One wonders what brought him to Cravenwell in the first place, so small a village, and so far from London. Commercial travellers go where the commerce takes them, Miss Marple, Pascoe said, not looking up from the flower bed. I shouldn't think there was any mystery in it. Oh, I'm sure you're quite right, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. Though it is curious, isn't it, how a man with no connection to a place so often turns out, on closer inspection, to have a connection after all. I find that nearly always the case in my experience. People so rarely arrive anywhere entirely by accident. She said this in the mild, faintly vague manner she generally reserved for observations she wished to make without appearing to make them at all, and continued on her way before the doctor could formulate a reply, though she noted, with the part of her mind that noted such things and rarely forgot them, that he had set down his trowel rather more sharply than the task required. Chapter 4. A Stranger's Habits. Miss Marple was not, in the ordinary way, given to inserting herself into matters that were not her concern, and she would have been the first to say so, with perfect sincerity, to anyone who asked. But there was something in the small, persistent puzzle of the shut window that would not leave her thoughts alone, in the way that a single dropped stitch will not leave a piece of knitting alone until it has been found and corrected. She spent that Wednesday afternoon ostensibly taking tea with her godson, young Mr. Edward Tarrant, who had taken up his post as schoolmaster only that spring and was glad of any company that did not consist entirely of his 30 pupils. But a good deal of their conversation turned, despite his evident reluctance, to the death at the inn. The whole village has decided it's Renshaw, he told her, refilling her cup, which seems hard on the fellow, given that nobody's found him to ask. He's done nothing worse than drink too much and owe everyone money, so far as I know. And what do you make of the dead man, Edward? You met him, I think, at supper on Tuesday. Only briefly. He asked me about the church, wanted to know if the old parish records were still kept here, or if they'd been moved to the county archive. Seemed very particular about it. I told him Reverend Laycock keeps the older registers himself, in the vestry, and he seemed pleased to hear it. Miss Marple set down her cup with the small, careful precision she brought to everything. Parish records, now that is interesting. What sort of records, did he say? Births and deaths, I should think, from the way he asked, though he didn't say which ones or why. It was a small thing, and Edward Tarrant, watching his godmother's face, could not have said why it seemed to interest her so particularly. But interest her it did, and she turned the subject only after extracting every detail he could remember of the conversation, down to the precise wording Mr. Harmon had used. That evening, returning to Willowbrook Inn in the lengthening dusk, she found occasion to speak with Daisy Fenn in the kitchen, where the girl was washing up the supper things with the particular fierceness of someone trying not to think about what she had found that morning. "You mustn't distress yourself so, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, taking up a tea towel without being asked, in the manner of a woman entirely accustomed to making herself useful in other people's kitchens. It was a great shock finding him so, but you mustn't blame yourself for the window. I'm sure you did exactly as he asked. "I did, miss, I swear it," Daisy said, scrubbing harder than the plate required. "Left it open a good 4 inches, same as he wanted, on account of his chest. I remember it special, because he gave me a shilling for remembering, which nobody does, not in this house." "And you're quite certain it was open when you left him for the night?" "Certain as I'm standing here. I drew the curtain across it myself, and I felt the draught come in while I did it. Cold as anything." Daisy's hands stilled in the basin. "So how'd it come to be shut by morning, miss? That's what I keep asking myself. Who'd have gone in and shut it, and never said a word to anyone?" It was, Miss Marple reflected, walking up to her own small room a little later, precisely the question that mattered most, and precisely the question that no one but herself, and possibly Daisy Fenn, seemed inclined to ask at all. Chapter 5. The Quarrel at the Crossroads. Thomas Renshaw was found on the Thursday morning, not fleeing toward any port or railway station as village imagination had supplied, but asleep in his uncle's hayloft, 2 miles outside Cravenwell, where he had gone, by his own account, simply to avoid the row he knew would follow when his creditors learned he had sold his late father's pocket watch to settle the worst of his debts at the public house. Inspector Hargreave questioned him at length, with Sergeant Coombs taking notes, in the small front room of the police house in Marsh Otterton. "You were seen quarrelling with the deceased on Tuesday afternoon," Hargreave said, "by the churchyard wall." Witnesses heard raised voices. Renshaw, a lean young man of perhaps 26, with the restless, faintly hunted look of someone who had spent some years disappointing people he wished he hadn't, did not deny it. "He asked me about my father," Renshaw said. "Wanted to know things when he died, how, where he was buried. I told him it was none of his business, and he laughed at me. Said everything in a small village was everyone's business sooner or later. I told him to go to the devil and walked off. That's the whole of it. And you'd never met him before Tuesday, never set eyes on him, yet he wanted to know about your father. That's what I said, isn't it?" Renshaw's hands, Hargreave noted, were shaking slightly, though whether from fear, drink, or simple exhaustion was not immediately clear. "I don't know why. I didn't kill him, Inspector, whatever the village is saying. I was 3 sheets to the wind in the plough by 9 o'clock and asleep in my uncle's loft by 11, and there's a dozen men can swear to the first half of that, if not the second. It was an alibi of the unsatisfying, half-verifiable kind that troubled cases rather than resolved them, and Hargreave, despite his earlier confidence, found himself obliged to release Renshaw without charge, while making it clear he was not to leave the district. The detail of the questions about his father, however, reached Miss Marple by the usual circuitous village route, by way of Sergeant Coombs's sister, who kept the post office, to Mrs. Whitfield, who repeated it at length over the counter while purchasing stamps, in the hearing of Miss Ashworth, who repeated it again to anyone within range, and it struck her, turning the detail over with the same patient attention she gave to a difficult pattern in lace, as significant in a way the village had not yet grasped. A stranger does not ask after a dead man's grave for no reason at all. He asks because the grave, or the manner of the death, or the name upon the stone, matters to him. And a man whose business is asking such questions of strangers in small villages is, in Miss Marple's considerable experience of human nature, very often engaged in one particular and unlovely trade. She did not say this aloud to anyone, but she did, the following morning, walk the half-mile to the churchyard and spend a considerable time among the older gravestones near the yew hedge, reading names and dates with the slow, unhurried interest of a woman who had nothing better to do with her mourning, though anyone watching closely might have noticed that she paused longest and looked most thoughtful before a stone bearing the name Renshaw and the date of a death some 15 years past. Chapter 6. Threads of Old Linen. It was the Reverend Aubrey Laycock who, quite unwittingly, provided Miss Marple with the next thread in what was becoming, in her own private estimation, a far more tangled piece of work than the village yet suspected. She had called at the vicarage on the pretext of discussing the autumn flower rota for the church, a subject in which she had genuine and long-standing interest, and found the vicar in his study surrounded by the leather-bound parish registers he had evidently been consulting before her arrival. "Forgive the disorder," he said, gathering the volumes with faint embarrassment. "I've had rather an odd request, that Mr. Harmon, before he died, wrote to me some weeks ago, asking to view the registers when he visited, births, marriages, and deaths for the parish, going back to 1920 or thereabouts. I thought nothing of it at the time. Genealogists write to me 2 or 3 times a year, tracing some family connection or other." "And did he say which family interested him?" "He didn't, not in the letter. I assumed I'd learn more when he called, but of course—" The vicar spread his hands, a small, sorrowful gesture. "He never had the chance." Miss Marple, glancing at the open register on the desk, allowed her eye to travel, quite innocently, or so it appeared, down the page of marriages for the year 1936, where it came to rest, with what looked very much like idle curiosity, upon a particular entry. "How thorough these old records are," she observed. "One forgets how much they reveal, if one only takes the trouble to look. Why, here's a marriage I'd quite forgotten. Agnes Mary Holloway. Was it not, before she became Mrs. Crewe? I don't believe I ever knew her maiden name." "I believe so, yes," the vicar said, somewhat surprised by the turn of conversation, "though I confess I don't know a great deal about Mrs. Crewe's life before she came to the village. She and Walter married rather quietly, after she'd been a widow some years, I understood." "A widow," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "How sad. And from where did she come, do you recall?" "Portsmouth, I believe, or perhaps Plymouth, somewhere along the coast. She's never spoken of it much, and I haven't liked to pry. So many people lost so much in the war, Miss Marple. One learns not to ask." "Indeed one does," Miss Marple agreed, in a voice of perfect, untroubled mildness, though she found herself, walking home a little later, through the lengthening shadows of the lane, turning the word widow over in her mind, with rather more attention than the vicar's casual mention of it might ordinarily have warranted, for it had occurred to her, not for the first time in a long life of noticing such things, that the word was very often used by people who could not, with strict accuracy, claim it for their own. Chapter 7. What the Walls Overheard. The inquest, held on the Friday in the village hall before a coroner brought down specially from Louis, proved very nearly as brief as Inspector Hargreave had predicted, returning a verdict of accidental death by gas asphyxiation, with the coroner remarking, not unkindly, upon the dangers of antiquated heating apparatus in old buildings. But if the official matter was closed, the village's interest was not, and it was in the days following the inquest that a number of smaller, private conversations took place, which would, in time, prove a good deal more illuminating than anything said before the coroner. Daisy Fenn, lingering in the inn's narrow back passage on the evening before the inquest, had overheard, quite without meaning to, she would insist afterward, a conversation between Agnes and Walter Crewe behind the half-closed door of their private sitting-room, conducted in the low, urgent tones of people who believe themselves unheard. "He knew me, Walter. He knew me the moment he saw me at supper. I could tell it in his face. 15 years, and he knew me at once. You're imagining things, Agnes. The man's never set foot in this village before Tuesday." "I'm not imagining it," he asked me, when I brought up his case, whether I'd ever lived near Portsmouth. Near Portsmouth, Walter, in that particular way he had of asking, as though he already knew the answer and only wanted to watch me lie about it. "And did you?" A long silence. Then, "I told him I'd never been further west than Brighton in my life." Daisy had not understood at the time what significance to attach to this exchange, and had mentioned it to no one but her mother 2 days later, over the washing line, from which it travelled, by the usual village currents, eventually to Miss Marple's ear, by way of the most circuitous and unlikely chain of gossip, arriving nearly a week after it was spoken, but losing remarkably little in the telling. There was, too, a conversation between Dr. Pascoe and Mrs. Cordelia Whitfield, conducted with rather less discretion in the village shop, in which Mrs. Whitfield, never a woman to let a piece of information lie unused, remarked that she had heard, from a cousin who had served with the medical corps, certain things about the supply of medicines to the field hospitals near Pascoe's old regiment that she felt certain the doctor would rather not have repeated. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Whitfield," Pascoe had said, with a coldness that startled the shopkeeper's assistant, who reported the exchange to her employer within the hour. "Don't you, doctor? Well, perhaps it's nothing at all. People do talk so, don't they? Especially about the war. I dare say half of its invention." It was a remark calculated, as Mrs. Whitfield's remarks generally were, to wound without quite committing its speaker to anything that might be challenged. And it had the effect, observed by no one but the assistant, and later relayed to Miss Marple with considerable relish, of leaving Dr. Pascoe white about the mouth for the remainder of the afternoon. Chapter 8. The Letter in the Hat Box. It was Miss Prudence Ashworth who made, quite by accident, the discovery that would prove most material to the unravelling of the whole affair, though she would dine out on the story of how she came by it for a great many months afterward, embellishing it a little further with each telling. Mr. Harmon's effects, awaiting collection by relatives who had not yet been traced, remained boxed in a small room above the inn's stable, and it was there, while assisting Agnes Crewe in the unhappy business of cataloguing them for the solicitor, that Miss Ashworth came upon a battered leather hat box at the bottom of the dead man's larger trunk, fastened with a strap that had nothing to do with hats at all. Inside, beneath a false bottom that gave way under her curious fingers rather more easily than its maker had perhaps intended, lay a slim bundle of papers, carbon copies of letters, several photographs, and a small notebook filled with names, dates, and figures in a cramped, precise hand. She had the wit, at least, not to disturb the papers further, but sent at once for Inspector Hargreave, who arrived within the hour and spent a considerable time alone in the stable-room examining the find. What the notebook revealed, when its contents were eventually pieced together, first by Hargreave, and somewhat more completely, in private, by Miss Marple, to whom the inspector had begun, with some reluctance, to show a cautious respect, was that Mr. Felix Harmon had not been, as his card declared, a commercial traveller at all, but a man who had made a quiet and apparently profitable trade of discovering, and then monetizing, the buried secrets of people scattered across half a dozen counties. The notebook listed, among a dozen other names from villages Hargreave had never heard of, 3 entries that struck rather closer to home. A. Crewe, Holloway. Pemberton Bigamy, Pompey Reg, 1936, £40 demanded, and Dr. O. Pascoe, Calais Supply Discrepancy, 1944, Soldier Marsh, investigating further, and, more cryptically, Renshaw, T. Father's death, 1937. Insurance fraud? Follow-up. He was blackmailing half the village, Hargreave said, laying the notebook on the table before Miss Marple, with an expression somewhere between triumph and discomfort. 3 motives for murder, neatly written out by the victim himself, and not a one of them anything to do with the man we've already questioned twice over. 3 motives, perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, studying the cramped handwriting with great attention. Though I wonder, Inspector, whether it might not be more accurate to say 3 people with secrets, which is not, you know, quite the same thing as 3 murderers. A great many people have something they would rather not have known, without any of them being capable of taking a life to keep it hidden. The question that interests me far more is which of these three secrets was important enough and dangerous enough to be worth such a very particular and carefully arranged death. Chapter 9. Old Wounds, New Names. It was the second entry in the notebook, the cryptic reference to a soldier named Marsh and a supply discrepancy near Calais in 1944, that occupied Miss Marple's thoughts most persistently over the following days. For the bigamy concerning Agnes Crewe, distressing as it must have been to that lady, seemed to her a private sorrow rather than a motive for murder. A woman who had spent 15 years successfully concealing a youthful and unhappy first marriage was, in Miss Marple's long experience, far more likely to pay a blackmailer's modest demand than to risk the gallows over it. The matter of Dr. Pascoe was another thing entirely. She made discreet inquiries, a letter to an old acquaintance whose nephew had served in the same medical corps, a careful conversation with the Reverend Lecoq, who, as it happened, had corresponded briefly with an army chaplain during the war and retained a fondness for keeping up such connections. And what emerged, slowly, over the better part of a week, was a story considerably darker than the village's casual gossip had suggested. In the winter of 1944, in a field hospital near Calais, a young private named Joseph Marsh had died of complications following surgery. Complications, it was whispered among those who had served alongside him, that arose not from his wounds but from a batch of morphine that had been improperly diluted, sold off in part through irregular channels to supplement a junior medical officer's meagre pay. The matter had never been formally investigated. The chaos of the front, the press of more urgent casualties, and the sheer difficulty of proving such things against a man with an otherwise unblemished record had seen the affair quietly set aside. Dr. Owen Pascoe, Miss Marple learned from the chaplain's careful, regretful letter, had been that junior medical officer, and Felix Harmon, whose real name, Hargreave, eventually confirmed through records obtained from London, had been Felix Marsh before a change effected by deed poll some years previously, had been Joseph Marsh's younger brother. Not blackmail at all in his case, Miss Marple said to the vicar on the Sunday afternoon following this discovery, as they walked together in the churchyard among the gravestones she had studied so carefully a fortnight before. Or rather, blackmail as a means to an end he found more satisfying than the modest sums he was extracting from poor Mrs. Crewe. He wished, I think, to see Dr. Pascoe ruined and exposed for what happened to his brother, but he wished to enjoy the process first, to watch the man suffer under threat before he delivered the final blow. He had waited 15 years, after all. A little longer cost him nothing, or so he believed. And it cost him his life instead, the Reverend Lecoq said quietly. A terrible thing, Miss Marple, however badly the man himself may have behaved toward others, to die for a sin that was, in its way, an act of grief. Grief curdled into something else entirely, I think, Miss Marple said, which is so often the way of these things. But you are quite right that it is terrible. Murder generally is, whatever reasons a person finds to justify it to themselves in the small hours of the night. Chapter 10. A Second Silence. It was 3 days after the discovery of the notebook that the second alarming event of the affair occurred, one which, far from clarifying matters, threatened for a time to plunge the investigation into still greater confusion. Mrs. Cordelia Whitfield, who had made no secret of her own curiosity regarding the contents of Felix Harmon's notebook, and had, by various means of persuasion and outright cajolery, extracted from Sergeant Coombs's sister a good deal more detail than the police would have wished her to possess, was found by her daily woman on the Tuesday morning, collapsed at the foot of her own cellar stairs, having apparently lost her footing in the dark. She survived, a fortunate circumstance attributed by Dr. Pascoe, who attended her, to the thickness of the old coconut matting that had broken her fall, but remained unconscious for the better part of 2 days, during which the village's earlier theories regarding Thomas Renshaw, already weakened by the discovery of the notebook, gave way almost entirely to a fresh wave of speculation. "Pushed," Mr. Birtwell declared in the tap-room that evening, with the flat certainty of a man who had decided upon his opinion before considering the evidence. "Stands to reason, she knew too much, that one, and never could keep a still tongue about it." It was a theory Inspector Hargreave was inclined, initially, to take seriously, for Mrs. Whitfield's cellar stairs, upon examination, showed no obvious sign of the loose tread or worn carpet that might explain an accidental fall, and her own daily woman reported that her mistress had seemed, in the days before her fall, unusually preoccupied and anxious, given to starting at unexpected noises, and once remarking, apropos of nothing, that she rather wished she had kept her observations to herself. Miss Marple, however, visiting the unconscious woman's bedside on the Wednesday at the invitation of the doctor attending from Marsh Otterton, Dr. Pascoe himself having tactfully withdrawn from the case, on the grounds that his own name appeared in connection with the affair, formed a rather different impression of events. "You will forgive an old woman's curiosity, Inspector," she said to Hargreave afterward, in the inn's front parlour, "but I could not help noticing, when I examined the cellar stairs myself this morning, that there is a quantity of flour scattered upon the third step from the top. Flour, and not dust, which is a very different substance, and behaves quite differently underfoot. Mrs. Whitfield's housekeeper tells me she had been baking that very afternoon, and is in the habit of carrying her flour bin down to the cool of the cellar between bakings, a journey she makes, by her own account, 2 or 3 times a week, always in rather too much haste." "You think it was an accident, then, after all this?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that it would be a very great mistake to assume that every misfortune occurring in the wake of a murder is necessarily connected to it. People do fall down their own cellar stairs, Inspector, quite without anyone's assistance, particularly when they are carrying a heavy bin of flour and thinking rather more about gossip than about their footing. But I will grant you this much. Whoever frightened Mrs. Whitfield into her present state of nerves, whether by word or by deed, very probably knew exactly what they were doing, even if they never laid a hand upon her at all." Chapter 11. The Geyser and the Glass. It was the gas geyser itself, the very appliance that had provided, from the first morning, the official and apparently uncomplicated explanation for Mr. Harmon's death, that Miss Marple finally turned her full attention to, some 10 days after the murder, when the village's interest had begun, as village interest generally does, to drift toward fresher subjects. She obtained, through the patient and somewhat puzzled cooperation of Inspector Hargreave, permission to examine the bathroom along the corridor from the dead man's room, where the offending appliance remained, sealed off and unused since the inquest. It was an old model, as Mr. Birtwell had correctly observed, its enamel chipped and its pilot flame inclined to flicker in a draught. Entirely capable, the original examination had concluded, of producing a dangerous quantity of carbon monoxide if left burning in a poorly ventilated space. But it was a small detail, overlooked in the general examination, that caught Miss Marple's particular attention. A faint scorch mark, no larger than a shilling, on the underside of the appliance's outer casing, where a screw securing the flue connector had been loosened, and then, judging by the slight roughness of the thread, visible under close inspection, retightened, though not quite so far as it had originally been turned. A man wishing the geyser to draw badly, and to send its fumes into the room beyond rather than safely up the flue, need only loosen that single screw, she explained to Hargreave, who had brought along, at her request, the local ironmonger to confirm her reading of the mechanism. A very small adjustment, easily made by anyone with a modicum of skill with tools, and easily reversed afterward, once its purpose had been served, so that the appliance would appear, to any but the most careful examination, to have failed entirely of its own accord. "And who in this village," Hargreave asked slowly, would know enough of gas fittings to manage such a thing, and think to undo it again afterward. A great many people, in the ordinary way of things. Walter Crewe maintains the inn's own fittings himself, I believe, and Mr. Birtwell is forever boasting of his skill with such matters. But there is another consideration that interests me a good deal more, Inspector, which is this. The gas in that room would have taken some hours to do its work, given the size of the chamber and the modest leak such a small adjustment would produce. Whoever made that adjustment did not do so in a moment of sudden passion, in the heat of an argument. They calculated, quite coldly, the precise hour at which they must act, in order that the result should appear, the following morning, entirely natural, and they possessed, I should think, sufficient medical knowledge to be confident of how such a death would present, and how readily it might be mistaken for misadventure by anyone not specifically looking for foul play. She paused, setting down the small magnifying glass she had borrowed for the examination, and looked at the inspector with an expression of mild, almost apologetic regret. I think you will find, Inspector, that there is only one person in Cravenwell who possesses both the practical knowledge of gas appliances that this required and the medical training to know precisely how such a death would appear to a coroner, and who had, besides, very much the strongest reason of anyone in this village to wish Mr. Felix Harmon silenced before he could deliver, at his evident leisure, the full and ruinous truth he had been so patiently assembling. Chapter 12. The Vicar's Ledger. It was at this point in the affair, with suspicion settling, however quietly, upon Dr. Owen Pascoe, that a fresh complication arose, one which threatened, for a brief but uncomfortable interval, to scatter the threads of the investigation in an entirely new direction. The Reverend Aubrey Laycock, summoned by Inspector Hargreave to clarify a minor point regarding the parish registers Mr. Harmon had examined, became visibly distressed during the course of the interview, and at length confessed, with evident shame, that he too had reason to fear discovery in connection with the dead man's inquiries, for the church accounts, which he had administered alone for some 11 years, contained certain irregularities relating to the restoration fund for the bell tower, monies that had, over a period of some years, found their way toward the settlement of his late wife's medical expenses, rather than toward the masonry they had been collected to repair. "I never spoke to Mr. Harmon of money," the vicar said miserably, "but he asked me, the very afternoon before he died, whether the parish accounts were audited regularly, and by whom, and I confess I gave him an answer that was not entirely truthful. I have been sick with dread ever since, wondering whether he had somehow learned of my failing, and whether I might not, in some confused way I cannot quite account for, be thought to have had a hand in his death, merely by wishing, in a weak moment, that he had never come to Cravenwell at all." It was a confession that Inspector Hargreave, despite his evident sympathy for the vicar's distress, was obliged to investigate, and the better part of 2 days was spent establishing, to general and considerable relief, that the Reverend Lecoq had spent the whole of the fatal evening visiting a dying parishioner in the company of 2 witnesses, a fact that placed him entirely beyond suspicion regarding the murder itself, whatever view the church authorities might eventually take of his handling of the restoration fund. Miss Marple, hearing the full account from the vicar himself, who came to her in considerable distress seeking what comfort she could offer, was characteristically gentle in her response. "You have done a foolish thing, Mr. Laycock, and I think you know it without my telling you so, but foolishness and wickedness are very different matters, and a man who borrows from one fund to pay a dying wife's doctors, intending all the while to repay it, is engaged in something a great deal more human and forgivable than the sort of calculated cruelty that ended Mr. Harmon's life. I should go to your bishop and confess the whole of it honestly, before this affair forces the truth out in some less sympathetic manner. People are generally kinder than we expect, when we have the courage to be honest with them first, rather than waiting to be discovered." It was advice the vicar took, eventually, and with considerable trepidation, and one which, though it forms no part of the murder itself, did a great deal to restore, in time, both his own peace of mind and the village's rather battered confidence in its spiritual shepherd. Chapter 13. Tea and a Trap. Having satisfied herself, through patient inquiry and careful observation, as to the true nature of Dr. Pascoe's connection to the dead man, Miss Marple found herself faced with the more delicate problem of proof, for suspicion, however well founded, was not evidence that would satisfy a court of law, and the doctor, she was well aware, was a man of considerable composure who would not easily be startled into an open confession. It was with this difficulty in mind that she arranged, through the unwitting assistance of Mrs. Whitfield, now sufficiently recovered to resume her customary place at the centre of village conversation, a small tea party at Willowbrook Inn, ostensibly to mark Mrs. Whitfield's return to health, but attended, by careful design, by every person whose name had appeared in Felix Harmon's notebook, together with Inspector Hargreave, introduced to the gathering as an old acquaintance of Miss Marple's down from London for the day. The conversation, steered with deceptive gentleness by Miss Marple herself, turned eventually, as she had intended it should, to the subject of the inn's old gas geyser, and the question of whether Walter Crewe intended to have it replaced before the inn reopened in spring. "I understand the ironmonger found a screw had worked loose," Miss Marple observed, addressing the table at large with an air of mild, almost vacant curiosity. "Such a very small thing to have such consequences. I confess I find myself wondering how anyone would know to loosen such a screw in such a particular way. Enough to cause the trouble, but not so much as to be obvious to a casual glance. It would require, I should think, someone with real knowledge of how such appliances are constructed. A plumber, surely," said Mrs. Whitfield, "or a gas company man. Or," Miss Marple continued, in the same mild tone, "someone trained to understand exactly how the body responds to such a poisoning. Who would know, for instance, precisely how many hours a small leak would require to prove fatal in a room of that size, and precisely what symptoms a coroner would expect to find, and would not find anything amiss in. A doctor, perhaps, would possess just such particular knowledge." There was a silence at the table that lasted, by Inspector Hargreave's private estimation, perhaps 4 seconds, though it felt, to those present, considerably longer. "You are looking at me, Miss Marple," Dr. Pascoe said at last, his voice carefully level, "as though you suspect I had some hand in this." "I am looking at you, Doctor, because you alone among us possess the precise combination of knowledge that this crime required," Miss Marple said, setting down her teacup with great gentleness. "And because I have learned, in the course of a long life spent watching my fellow creatures, that a man who has carried a private guilt for 15 years, believing it safely buried, behaves very differently when that guilt is suddenly and unexpectedly threatened with exposure than a man who has nothing at all to hide. I do not think, Dr. Pascoe, that you are a wicked man by nature. I think you have been a frightened one for a very long time, and that fear, allowed to grow unchecked in private for years on end, can drive even a fundamentally decent person to do something they would once have thought entirely beyond them." Chapter 14. The Confession in the Surgery. It was not at the tea table, however, that the final reckoning came, but some 2 hours later, in the quiet of Dr. Pascoe's own surgery, where he had asked Miss Marple, with a kind of exhausted resignation that seemed almost a relief to him, whether she would do him the courtesy of hearing the whole truth before Inspector Hargreave returned, with whatever formal questions the law required. "Joseph Marsh died because of a decision I made under pressure, I told myself, at the time was unavoidable," he said, standing at the window with his back to her, looking out over the darkening garden. "We were desperately short of supplies, and a man I knew, a quartermaster sergeant with connections I shouldn't have trusted, offered me morphine at a price I could just barely afford, diluted, as it turned out, with something that should never have gone near an open wound. I told myself I had no choice, I told myself, afterward, that the dilution wasn't something I could have known, though I have never been entirely honest with myself about that, not in 15 years. And when his brother came to Cravenwell, I knew him the moment he sat down to supper. The resemblance was extraordinary, and when he began asking his careful questions, watching me with that particular patience of his, I understood at once what he intended. Not exposure, not at first. He wanted to watch me suffer first, to extract whatever small humiliations he could, before delivering the final blow. He told me so himself, that very evening, when he caught me alone in the corridor, told me he had waited 15 years and could afford to wait a little longer, that he wanted me to understand exactly what was coming before it came. Pascoe's voice had grown very quiet. I have spent 11 years in this village believing I had made some kind of peace with what happened. I had not. I understood that very clearly, standing in that corridor, listening to him describe in perfectly pleasant tones exactly how he intended to ruin everything I had built. And so you went to his room that night. I went to his room that night, Pascoe agreed, and I did what I had spent the whole of that terrible afternoon convincing myself was the only remaining course left to me. I am not asking you to forgive it, Miss Marple. I have not forgiven it myself, and I do not expect I ever shall. When Inspector Hargreave returned some 20 minutes later, he found Dr. Pascoe seated quietly at his own desk, his written confession already drafted in the same precise, careful hand that had recorded 100 prescriptions over 11 years of patient service to a village that had trusted him without question, and Miss Marple sitting opposite him, her knitting forgotten in her lap, her expression one of profound and weary sorrow rather than any satisfaction in having been, once again, entirely correct. Chapter 15. When the tide turned Willowbrook Inn closed for the winter on schedule, some 10 days later than Walter and Agnes Crewe had originally intended, the delay occasioned by the necessary formalities of an arrest, a remand, and the departure of 2 police constables who had, for the better part of a fortnight, made the small front parlour very nearly their second home. The village settled, gradually, back into its accustomed rhythms. Mrs. Whitfield recovered fully from her fall and resumed, with undiminished enthusiasm, her position at the centre of every conversation worth having, though she was observed thereafter to take rather more care upon her own cellar stairs. Thomas Renshaw, cleared at last of every suspicion, found steady work at the smithy and began, slowly, to repay his debts in a manner that earned him, for the first time in some years, the village's cautious approval. The Reverend Laycock made his confession to the bishop, and was permitted, after a period of penance, and the gradual repayment of the Restoration Fund from his own modest savings, to continue his ministry, somewhat chastened, but loved no less for it by a congregation that had, on the whole, found it easier to forgive him than he had found it to forgive himself. Agnes Crewe's own small secret, that early and unhappy first marriage so many years past, emerged eventually into the quiet light of village knowledge, and proved, as Miss Marple had privately predicted, a good deal less scandalous in the telling than in the long years of dreading it had ever seemed, Cravenwell, on the whole, preferring an old sorrow honestly admitted to a guilty secret nursed in silence. Of Dr. Pascoe there was little more to say, beyond the formal proceedings that would, in time, run their course according to the law's own measured pace. It was the Reverend Laycock, walking with Miss Marple along the lane above the mill pond on her final afternoon in Cravenwell, who asked the question that had, in one form or another, occupied a good deal of the village's conversation in recent weeks. "How did you know, Miss Marple? Truly know, I mean, not merely suspect, as I think we all suspected one person or another at various points." Miss Marple considered the question for a long moment, watching the last of the swallows gather above the water in preparation for their own departure southward. "I knew, I think, the very first afternoon, when I learned that the window had been found shut, though Daisy was so certain she had left it open," she said at last. "A small detail, and easily explained away by a dozen innocent possibilities, as indeed it very nearly was. But it troubled me, you see, because it suggested that someone in that house had gone into Mr. Harmon's room after Daisy left him for the night, and had done so with a purpose deliberate enough to require closing a window the dead man himself had been most particular about leaving open. After that, it was simply a matter of asking, patiently and without appearing to ask anything at all, who among us had both the knowledge to arrange such a death convincingly, and a wound deep enough and old enough to have festered into something capable of such a terrible decision. People reveal themselves so very readily, Mr. Lecoq, if one only takes the trouble to watch them quietly, and to listen to what they do not say quite as carefully as to what they do. It seems a melancholy sort of wisdom to carry through life, the vicar said, knowing people so well. Oh, I don't think it melancholy at all, Miss Marple replied, with the small, gentle smile that those who knew her well had learned to recognize as entirely her own. I have found, on the whole, that most people are very much better than their worst moment, given half a chance and a measure of patience. It is only that a very few, pressed hard enough by fear or grief or old unhealed wounds, allow that worst moment to take hold of them entirely. And it is no kindness to anyone, I think, to pretend otherwise, however much we might wish the world arranged more simply than it is. She left Cravenwell on the morning coach 2 days later, her knitting bag upon her knee, and the village already settling, as villages do, into the particular forgetting that allows ordinary life to resume, though it would be a long while yet before Willowbrook Inn was spoken of in Cravenwell, without a small instinctive pause, and a glance, however fleeting, toward the window of the room above the stable yard, where the last guest had spent his final night. The end.